Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone who is watching. My name is Derek Drakely. Today I'll be presenting my analysis on the nuclear freeze movement and the significance of its impact on other social movements. After providing a brief explanation of the events that led to and occurred during the nuclear freeze, I'll be analyzing a number of theories and methods that can be used to accurately apply to the social movement. Before the formation of the nuclear freeze movement, interest in peace movements had essentially died down since the Vietnam War. However, there was an ongoing nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union to increase the size and quality of the nuclear warfare. Both nations have been involved with the development and testing of destructive nuclear weapons. President Jimmy Carter had initially sought to cooperate with the Soviet Union by signing a pact that would establish a numerical limit between the two nations' strategic nuclear delivery vehicles and limit the deployment of new strategic offensive arms. This was known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, otherwise known as SALT II, which was modified from the SALT I treaty that was made years prior. The treaty had been signed by both leaders in June of 1979 but was left unratified. President Carter eventually postponed action on the SALT II treaty with the Soviet Union after acting in response to the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan in December of the same year. They had been continuing the deployment and stockpiling of their nuclear weapons, which left Congress uncertain and divided about how to perceive these threats. The idea of a freeze movement was discussed before Ronald Reagan's election to support people in Senate and Congress who wanted to see good arms control agreement with the Soviet Union. However, Reagan, who had opposed every single one of these control agreements, was the first president to decide not to enter a control agreement with Russia. As part of his campaign promise, he boosted the national defense spending by an immense amount, nearly quadrupling the federal budget debt. The nuclear freeze movement was first conceived in 1979 by peace activist Randall Forsberg. Forsberg, who became the executive director for the Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies, was the primary leader that launched the movement. Her primary goal was to stop the nuclear arms race and end intervention as the initial step toward the reduction of nuclear weapons and improving relations with the East. These intentions were aimed at preventing a potentially catastrophic nuclear war through an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union to adopt a mutual freeze on the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons, as well as the aircraft that were designed to deliver them. Forsberg began drafting the Call to Halt the Nuclear Arms Race, which emphasized that the freeze would maintain equal parity of nuclear weapons that both nations had possessed, halting the arms race and allowing the opportunity to make deep reductions in the number of nuclear weapons overall. Forsberg had argued that the deployment was an enormous waste of money and resources being put into nuclear weapons. The call was published in April of 1980 and garnered the support of most American peace organizations, but was also endorsed by public leaders and activists, as well as numerous religious, professional, and labor organizations. The early efforts of movement mobilization centered on the idea of the freeze propagating at the local level. The initial efforts to advance the movement placed a strong emphasis on grassroots education and organization in order to expand the number of people supporting the campaign. This involved activists distributing pamphlets and other literature about the nuclear arms race and bringing solutions to various organizations at city councils and state governments. Signatures for support were gathered on freeze partitions locally, and opinion surveys confirmed the vast popularity of the freeze movement as it began to spread. On June 12, 1982, the largest political demonstration in American history up until that point occurred, when approximately 1 million participants gathered in New York Central Park to protest for nuclear disarmament and to put an end to the nuclear arms race. These efforts led to a substantial amount of success as a freeze resolution was proposed for the national elections in 1982 by multiple states. After Reagan's re-election in 1984, however, a mutual freeze with the Soviet Union was never negotiated. The movement eventually diminished and died out in the late 1980s. However, the success and impact of the nuclear freeze campaign would cause the Reagan administration to reverse their nuclear policies and to change their rhetoric. This was, however, until the early 1990s when the United States and the Soviet Union ceased the development, deployment, and testing of their nuclear weapons and greatly reduced their quantity and dropped any threats of a nuclear attack. Now that I've discussed the background of the nuclear freeze campaign, I'll provide my analysis on some of the social movement theories and concepts and apply them to our movement. When understanding different concepts and theories of social movements, we're examining the ways in which movements emerge from the discontent of a particular event or common grievance, how the movement effectively organizes and mobilizes its supporters, and the strategies and tactics utilized to determine what form of outcome the movement may achieve. To begin my analysis, I started searching for theories that explain the process of movement mobilization, so my initial research took me to analyzing resource mobilization theory. With resource mobilization theory, social movement organizations seek out people who want to support the goals of the movement, making the distinction between people who want to benefit from the cause from those who are just supporting because it's the right thing to do. This theory accentuates the importance of requiring resources for the development and success of the movement, meaning the ability to effectively utilize resources may determine the success of the movement. These resources may be tangible material goods such as money or supplies, or even human expertise such as labor or skills, amongst other resources. These are incentivized to draw people into the movement. While it may be plausible for SMOs to offer these incentives to individuals to join their movement, the main problem with this theory is that it places far too much emphasis on resources. Rather than the support for the cause being the incentive itself, it ignores the emotions of the public. Resources weren't drawing people in because they were looking to gain benefits or an item of value out of it. The public had increasing concerns regarding the threat of a possible devastating nuclear war. One researcher took a survey on the mobilization for a city's local freeze movement, I believe Cleveland. I'm going to be paraphrasing some quotes for this one. He mentions that an individual's resources and self-interest have been found to be unrelated to the level of participation. There was no increase regarding resources to participation levels, even those that had greater resources and self-interest. Additionally, he mentions that material resources don't play a motivational role with the freeze movement, regardless of its conceptual meaning. So because of this, I realized that there had to be a different explanation of the freeze movement's mobilization in which people were seeking to make social change to the political system. Because of these reasons, the main theory that we'll be using to explain the nuclear freeze movement is with political process theory. Formulated by sociologist Douglas McAdam and later revised, political process theory stems from the idea of political opportunity structures and is a standard explanation for social movement mobilization. Since social movements require more than just resources in order to succeed, we need to examine the larger political environment. The theory consists of three key components in its modern revision: political opportunities, mobilizing structures, and framing processes. Political opportunities are the most important aspect of the theory. Without them, the success of social movements would become unattainable. In order to understand the existence of political opportunities, the social movement activists must become aware of an opening within the political system to take advantage of it. Political opportunities may result from a change in the degree of power inequality between the challenging group and their targets, divisions amongst power elites, increasing diversity within the political establishment, and the unbinding of repressive structures that otherwise would have strained individuals from wanting to demand social change. Therefore, there must be a vulnerability within the political system. In the context of the freeze movement, changes in presidential policies like Carter abandoning action of the SALT II Treaty with the Soviet Union signified division between the two elite nations and revealed political opportunities. Additionally, the alarming rhetoric of Reagan's administration kept the U.S. locked in this unnerving sense of fear for a nuclear crisis, where because of his opposition for a mutual freeze of nuclear arms, he continued the buildup of military weapons and made statements boasting about triumph over a nuclear war. The threat of a nuclear war made Americans turn to means to prevent it from occurring, which revealed vulnerability in the political system and increased involvement in the freeze movement. Next is the idea of mobilizing structures, which is when we would need some existing organizations and institutions that are favorable in protesting the movement. The collective group of organizations that provide varying degrees of membership, leadership, and communication includes not only previously existing organizations, but activists from social movements that had experiences with supporting other causes, and the informal networks among potential activists. Forsberg was explicit about creating a vast grassroots movement that would grow into a national cause. They had asked large quantities of peace movements that had worked at the national level to endorse the movement and send local activists to create and distribute petitions around the local area. The Freeze movement was strengthened by the endorsements of multiple established organizations. This is including most major U.S. religious organizations that expressed their support for the Freeze, including the National Council of Churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the United Presbyterian Church, and the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers movement, as well as many more. And yet hundreds of national organizations, many of which had never provided a stance on national defense issues before, became involved to support the Freeze movement during this critical time. This involved various women's movements and health organizations, so the collective impact of all of these associated movements were substantial for the Freeze movement, and the unity of protesters would be a key influence in later social movements. Adding on to this idea, I'm going to be playing a short clip from a documentary on the notable June 1982 rally that occurred in New York. It basically touches on the religious organizations that got involved with the Nuclear Freeze movement rally.
And now the time has come, and they have come to speak of many things. From Bologna, Italy, and Beatrice, Nebraska, Edogawa, Japan, and East Harlem in New York City. A great ingathering of people, some to demonstrate, some to make a beginning, some to challenge, some non-violently to bear witness. But sharing a single idea, all governments must stop the madness of nuclear armament, the building of weapons so fast, so accurate, and so devastating that they invite a nuclear first strike.
I guess basically I have to be an optimist from the point of view of my religious faith. I think Quakers are basically optimistic about the universe because we feel that the universe is intended to be peaceful. Well, what's happened in the last year and a half, 2 years with the growing Freeze movement and the peace movement has been terribly exciting and very, very encouraging. A lot of long, slow, nitty-gritty, unrewarding work is finally in the open, and that's very exciting and very gratifying.
Lastly, the framing strategies and tactics that are utilized by social movements are crucial. Most of the public were concerned about the threats posed by the nuclear arms race and the potential outbreak of a nuclear war, but Forsberg managed to frame the nuclear freeze as a very logical resolution because of the sheer quantity, the tens of thousands of nuclear weapons that both the United States and the Soviet Union had possessed and were continuing to produce as many. A freeze of nuclear arms would have save a considerable amount of money to be used for alternative economic spending options. The essence of framing from activists is necessary to motivate people to turn to activism and to unify the members of the movement to achieving a desired goal. There's a direct quote from Randall Forsberg herself during an interview to which she's examining the emotional state of members of the public, and we can use the framing method to understand the purpose of this. So she states directly, if we only look at the danger of nuclear war and the effects of nuclear weapons and the huge size of nuclear stockpiles, people become very depressed and demoralized and hopeless and despairing. What this means is that with the sense of turning a negative prospect into a positive step towards a national social change, it will motivate people to join the movement. In fact, the concept of the term freeze itself is symbolic of framing because it suggests the slowing down and eventually the stopping of the arms race cold before either nation struck with a nuclear attack. It exerts the feeling that something that appears so threatening could actually be brought under control if there was a strong and organized push to prevent it. But what about the framing of the news media? Because it should serve as crucial as a purpose as framing from the side of the activists. Well, what's interesting to note is that during this grassroots process that was going throughout 1980 and 1981, as organizations were collecting petition signatures locally to motivate and involve people to join the movement, nothing was being reported in the media. Only when it became a national cause did the media begin to frame the matter. Overall, while President Reagan did not make any direct changes to limit the arms race during his first term of presidency, the efforts of the nuclear freeze movement changed the rhetoric of the administration after having been declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and that should be avoided at all costs, with the actual policies with negotiating with Russia occurring in the early 90s. The nuclear freeze movement left an important legacy of a national effort to make social change in the political structure. Thank you for watching. Stay safe.